Hello and welcome to the Beautiful Business Podcast, where today I'm very excited to be joined by Amy Sandler. For those of you that don't know, Amy is the lead coach and podcast host at Radical Candor. She's a professional speaker, a corporate mindfulness trainer, an executive coach, and a certified breathwork and meditation teacher who's passionate about mindfulness, emotional intelligence, positive psychology, and optimizing performance, to name just a few things. Amy has spent over 20 years in senior roles of some huge organisations and has some pretty awesome life hobbies such as performing stand-up comedy and walking on fire. Yes, I will be asking her about these and why she keeps going back for more. I'll also be asking her to share her career story so far, and it might not be a surprise to hear that today we'll be delving into the Radical Candor approach, what it is, how it works, the difference it can make to a team, and of course, the difficult parts of practicing it.
We actually want to start any relationship we're building by asking for feedback. And especially if we are managers, especially if we are leaders, especially if we have some form of power, we have got to lay down the power. But this goes for any work relationship. Start by asking for feedback. And the reason why I'm so motivated to practice Radical Candor is because relationships that really mattered to me were damaged because I didn't say the thing in the moment. And I think most important when we're asking for feedback, when we're trying to build a relationship, is we need to reward the candor.
Welcome to the Beautiful Business Podcast from the Wow Company. If you're searching for the right strategies, tools, and connections to ignite your thinking and elevate your business, then join us for a fortnightly dose of inspiration. Our guests range from industry-leading agencies and cutting-edge tech pioneers to motivational speakers and executives, all offering actionable insights to help you thrive in profit and purpose. So, whether you're a growing consultancy or an agency leader, this podcast is your source of knowledge and encouragement to spark meaningful change in your business and beyond. Amy, welcome to the podcast. It's lovely to have you here.
It's great to be here, Chloe. Thanks for the lovely intro. I'm excited to connect.
Yeah, me too. I start off every episode by asking the guest to tell us something about them as a person that's awesome. Now, we've already got a couple of things about you, but is there anything else about you that you would like to share with the world?
Well, I think it all depends on your definition of awesome. I'm trying to reframe my relationship with failure, which we can talk about. So one thing I think is awesome is that even though I went to Harvard twice, I still couldn't get a job as a bartender after graduating from Harvard Business School. I went to the Boston Bartender School thinking, hey, I'll get my Master of Mixology and I'll write the great American novel. I was not going to be able to write the great British novel. But apparently I couldn't write the great American novel or even bartend. So anyhow, it's through those failures, I think we learn even more about ourselves.
Absolutely. Amazing. And I've got to touch on the whole firewalking thing because it was one of the first things I read about you. And I was like, wow, tell me, how do you even come across the opportunity to firewalk? Was it a retreat?
Oh, just, walking down the street.
Yeah.
Just
sunny day.
Yeah, very sunny. So I got into all of these things, meditation and all sorts of different healing modalities a long time ago, back when I had to live sort of a double life, I had my day job and then I was doing all of these things that were very at the time out there, and now I think much more in the mainstream, which is also awesome from my perspective. And I started doing breathwork meditation with my teacher, David Elliott. At this point now, probably about 15 years ago. I'd done a lot of other work before then, but was really excited by this very active form of breathing. And one of the things that he did every New Year's in New Mexico was this firewalk. And the first few times I did it, I was like, this is, there's your comfort zone, and then there's your challenge zone, and then there's your panic zone. And then for me, there was like my WTF zone, I think, even beyond that. But what I would say about the firewalk, why I really love doing it, and I would only do it with David. So sort of number one is having an experienced guide who you trust, and I trusted David. Number two was you do this in a community, and so there's really that team connection. number 3 is that it's not just actually in the moment of the firewalk. There's been a lot of work leading up to it. So there's work that David has been doing for months and if not years with the trees and the land and just the whole natural experience that we're going to be recycling this fire and this firewood through our bodies, as well as the meditation that you do leading up to it. And then one of the things that's I think is coolest of the actual firewalk itself. So it's cold, there's snow. I have very sensitive feet. So honestly, the hardest part for me is like standing in my bare feet in the New Mexico cold winter. But the fire is built throughout the day and people are contributing to the fire and putting intentions into the fire and letting go of what they, sort of want to leave behind in the previous year. So you have an intention that you get to. And one of the things that I think is a really beautiful metaphor is that you come up with like a phrase that you're going to use for the firewalk. So, for example, things that I've used have been thank you or love. It can be very simple, but it's like what's going to guide you for the next year. And so every year I kind of think about what I want to bring in for the next year. And so everyone is on the side. So you've got this like group of people and at the start of the firewalk, and it's probably, and I don't know feet, let alone meters, but it's long enough to be like, it's not just 1 or 2 steps. It's maybe there's about, if people are standing together, there's maybe about 12 to 15 people, and then there's a few people at the end. And some people dance across it. I run across it. The important thing is that you're looking up at this one star, and inevitably, even if it's cloudy, a star emerges. You're looking up at the star. You start chanting, my body will do whatever it must to let me walk on fire. So you're already in this kind of altered state. And because your body is like, hey, what are you doing to me? And it's like, no, you can do it. And I'm going to look up at the star because if I look down on the ground and I see burning coals, my brain will be like, danger, danger. So you keep looking up at the stars. The people are guiding you. And then you go off. And for me, it's that moment of when you sort of leave and jump that is this kind of the scary part. But David's there and his sister is usually there and you feel supported. The people are there and you look up. And for me, it's just that sense of looking up, knowing that I'm guided by something more. And as you start moving, the group changes the chant from my body will do whatever it must to let me walk on fire, and they change it to your word. So all of a sudden you're hearing people love, or sacred family, or growth, or whatever it is at that person, and it's a pretty amazing feeling, and it's a very loving experience in the sense that after that people will like put your feet in the water and wash it off, and like everyone is just taking care of everyone else. And I think the biggest takeaway for me is that healing in whatever form can be a team sport. Like it's not just the individual, there's the coach and the group, and everyone has a part to play.
Wow. I get goosebumps just listening to you talk about that whole experience. It sounds really, really amazing. And I wonder, you talk about, just before that, you mentioned about kind of this journey with failure as well. Did you, not so much now, because you've done it, like 6 times now?
I've actually done it 7 times.
7.
And each time, it wasn't until the last couple times where I wasn't super nervous, but I still get nervous. It's like going to do a keynote or a workshop. I've done it thousands and thousands of times, but if I'm going to do a keynote in front of 1,000 people, you still get some of that energy. And I think that energy is powerful. Like it's like, what do you do with that energy? How do you harness that energy?
Absolutely. But I wonder, my question was going to be, like earlier on when you first started doing this experience, did you ever worry about failing at doing it? Did it ever come up for you that actually you might not do it, or whatever failure looked like for you?
It's such a great question. And one of the things I love about David is that he will start off, because there's a lot of other stuff happening that weekend, that retreat weekend. But of course, everyone is just focused on the firewalk. And he's like, he'll say, and he's from Kentucky, which is a more southern part of the U.S. So he'll have a bit of a drawl, be like, nobody's got to do the fire. Like, you don't have to do it. In fact, I'm assuming none of you want to do it. And, so it really takes the pressure off. And I always do give myself permission. Like, if I don't feel up for it, I don't have to do it. And I think that's really important, that it's not a sign of, I think with anything that we do that's sort of pushing us to our edge, it is really about knowing what is your edge, what is growth, what is like a helpful push and what is too much for where you are in that moment for your nervous system. And I think that we have to answer that for ourselves. And if we're really lucky too, we have people around us who are like, hey, like, that's okay, that support us wherever we are. So it's such a great question. I give myself permission each time to just see how I feel and if it will be something that will help. Invariably, I've done it every time. And if I go another time and I don't choose to do it, I'll be okay with that too.
Oh, good for you. Well, I'm listening out for number 8 if it happens.
Yeah.
So I mentioned in the beginning that you've got a real extensive history of kind of senior roles, and you've got all of these amazing kind of certifications behind you. Can you give us a bit of a career history in your own words?
In my own words, yeah. And, it always looks really perfectly planned when you in the rear view mirror, and we don't always know how it's going to go. So because I was a failed bartender, I did not get the job after my Harvard MBA as a bartender, nor did I get the job like my classmates. This was back when there was something called the internet. I don't know if you've heard of it. So I had some classmates, they were like employee 6 at Yahoo. And, anyhow, I did not do that. I went on sort of the income minimizing path where I, became a meditation teacher. I was doing all of this personal development, spiritual growth. But I did have a job. I did pay the bills, both in academia, where I was overseeing executive communications at UCLA, and working. I really, because I was so interested in leadership and development, I wanted to shift my career both from communications into more marketing and branding, as well as into more leadership focus. So I worked at organizations like YPO, Young Presidents Organization, and Vistage, which were CEO coaching organizations, as well as some behavioral health work that I did. But I was still on the kind of the marketing and communication side, sort of the business side of it, rather than actually doing the training and the leadership, which was really what I was very interested in. So what I would say is that for probably the bulk of my career, there were these two paths that were happening. One was my kind of day-to-day work, and the other was all of this other individual work that I was doing for my own personal development. And it really wasn't, and it was actually, frankly, a result of doing the firewalk and getting out of my comfort zone. Because for me, and I don't know how many of your listeners feel like this, working in a company versus being an entrepreneur, and some of those questions, even if you're working full-time, there might be projects that you might want to do, but you feel like, oh, can I do that? And so, one of the things that I decided was that I really wanted to start doing my own speaking and coaching, but having the safety of a job and a paycheck. So I became one of the first people certified to teach a program out of Google called Search Inside Yourself. This was just about 10 years ago. It's a mindfulness-based leadership, emotional intelligence training program. And I kind of thought like, okay, I'll do this program. It's very rigorous, very intense, a year long. It was really the first of its kind where it was marrying neuroscience and mindfulness to develop leadership. But I kind of thought like, okay, I'll do that. And then all of a sudden, all of these jobs will just magically fall from the sky. And you're nodding. I don't know if you've that's not actually how it works. So
no, I think we've just all been there, right? Where we thought if I do this, something will happen.
I do this one thing, it'll just right. So, so it was good. I still had the day job, and I was aware increasingly that every time I would go to this firewalk, and we would write down what we wanted to let go of, and I was like, I need to get out of this job. I need to get out of this job. I'm miserable, etc. But I would never do it. I would never take the leap. And all of a sudden, the universe was like, hey, remember this thing that you've been saying you wanted to happen? Well, here you go. And out of the blue, a week or two after, yet another amazing performance review, my job was eliminated. And it was just such a blow. I mean, I can't recall if you put it in the notes, but being a perfectionist at the time, recovering perfectionist, it was like, this was just a huge blow. I mean, so much of my identity was around this job. And even though I was miserable in this job, it was like, that was how I defined myself. So it was really a chance for me to put all of these tools into practice of how do I define myself? How do I move through the world without sort of the identity of this job and this title? And in fact, I had to show up at Search Inside Yourself. It was the following year, and I was a mentor. And so it's like, wow, that's interesting. I have to show up as a mentor, without a job. And what does that feel like? And that's really interesting. So that's another example of like these different firewalks we have every day in some ways of like, how do I sort of redefine who I am? And then I'd say I did end up getting another full-time job. It was very similar to the job that I had, but I knew I was really on a path to leap and to actually start to work on my own as a speaker. And I did that for a few years, teaching mindfulness all over the world to CEOs. And then since 2017, I've been at Radical Candor, and happy to share more about that.
Yeah, well, yes, excellent. Well, that brings us on nicely, actually, because, yeah, Radical Candor, like I said in the beginning, is what we're going to be delving into a little bit today. So you found yourself at Radical Candor. You're the lead coach there, podcast host as well. Can you just explain to anyone that might not have heard of Radical Candor before what it is?
Absolutely, yeah. So when I joined in 2017, I wore a few different hats. I was chief marketing officer, chief content officer. I mean, we're a very small company. And so Radical Candor as a company was co-founded by Kim Scott. Kim Scott wrote the book. Kim and I actually had gone to business school together. We didn't know each other at the time, but when Radical Candor came out, there was actually this viral talk that she gave that came out. And all of a sudden, being in Silicon Valley, everyone was like, create an app, create a company, all of this. So they created a company, originally created an app. At the time, realized like, what we really want to do is do workshops and training and in-person so that we can help people build better relationships at work. So I have the book right here, maybe a little fuzzy, but let's see if I can
got mine
put
as
it
well.
in.
We can both.
Oh, you got yours as well. And it's interesting because the UK subtitle that in the US, it's "Be a Kick-Ass Boss Without Losing Your Humanity." The subtitle in the UK is a little more blunt. And I would say the part of that subtitle, I think it's "Say what you mean to get what you want," or
how to get what you want by saying what you mean.
Yeah, which has is veering into something that I would call obnoxious aggression, which is really sort of about kind of intent. Another way to think about radical candor is compassionate candor. It's this idea that, first of all, the world of top-down command and control, telling people what to do, does not work. In order to succeed at work, we need to collaborate. To collaborate, we really need to build more trusting relationships at work. And I think we've especially seen this the last few years with the pandemic and all of the mental health challenges and all of the challenges that people are facing. So we need to collaborate. How can we build better relationships at work? Well, I think Radical Candor really provides that answer. And it focuses on three things, the book itself, that we need, if we are a manager, we need to create a culture of guidance. And by that, we mean where we are receiving feedback and giving feedback. So people are providing kind and clear feedback to each other. We need to help the people on our teams grow. So wherever we are in the organization, that we're there to grow and that we're putting people kind of in the right places to grow. And how do we make decisions? I think if we can, there's so much we don't agree on right now, but I think we all agree that people seem to hate meetings. So what kind of meetings? How do we make decisions? Do we even know what kind of meeting that we're in? And what has really struck all of this content, Kim is an amazing storyteller. There's so much great content in it from her time at Apple and at Google and all of these top companies. But it's really about describing, I think, the mistakes that she realized, as a leader, the environment that she wanted to be in, what really worked. I think that's been the secret sauce, why it's almost even more popular than it was, when it first came out. And what has really resonated with people is this idea of feedback. How can I give feedback in a way that is kind and clear? How can we sort of continue to motivate people? How can we build more trust and safety on our teams? And while the book was written for managers, the principles are really applicable across the board, wherever you are in an organization.
Yeah, I definitely second that. I loved the style that Kim used. So the way I recognize Radical Candor is, I guess, I don't know whether it's kind of a common practice, but to care personally and challenge directly.
The two big pieces, care personally, challenge directly. Exactly. If you've got any problem, how can I care personally and challenge directly? We tend to do one or the other. We tend to think at work, I've got to either be really caring or I've got to be really direct and really challenging, but we don't think we can do both of them. the reason why it's called radical is that it's rare that we both challenge and care about the people as real, live, actual human beings. And we joke, Kim had worked at McKinsey consulting firm for a few years. And the joke is like, if you ever have a problem, just put the two hard things in one of those little frameworks, 2 by 2. So I don't know what to do. Care personally, challenge directly. There's the framework. And we can talk about both what it is, and then I think even more important, what it isn't, the mistakes we make when we're not practicing radical candor.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think what that resonates with is kind of my family and my loved ones. I can absolutely care personally and challenge directly to those guys because, you know, your walls come down around the people that you love, don't they? And it's much easier to be challenging to them because it comes from a place of care just naturally. Whereas in the workplace, that is something that has to, or that can be built over time, or, you know, it doesn't necessarily come that naturally straight away. And I just wonder, what you just said there, you know, what parts of radical candor are particularly challenging and what parts come more easily, do you think?
It's such a great question. One of the things that we will do in our workshops, in our keynotes, is we'll tell stories, and we will encourage people to think about people in their own lives, not just at home, but to your point, like at work. You know, who is someone that you appreciate getting feedback from? And by the way, feedback is both praise and criticism. And the way that I'll tee it up is I'll usually share a story about a time when I received radical candor to kind of explain what it looks like for me, knowing that for different people, it's going to look a little different. You know, I recently graduated from business school, and like any graduate of Harvard Business School, I thought I was the greatest person to ever enter corporate America. And since we're talking globally, I'll say, if not the world. So I had a little to learn about humility, about leadership. And like I said, my background was in marketing. We had just launched this new website. And my boss, Steve, he was the chief marketing officer. We had this meeting with the CEO and the CFO. So after the meeting, we went for a little walk, and he asked how I thought the meeting went. I said, the meeting was amazing. The CFO was thrilled with the numbers. We came in under budget. The CEO was so happy. The board was really happy, and that made the CEO really happy. So it was great. Most exciting, I'd gotten this new project that I really wanted. So I was thinking I was on the top of the world. And Steve really congratulated me. He knew how hard I worked. And then he asked Amy, you know, what do you think Brooke and Jenny thought of the meeting? Now, Brooke was running the analytics and Jenny was running the content strategy. And I said, oh, they thought the meeting was great. And Steve nodded. He was very patient. He said, you know, did you notice the CEO asked Jenny about the content strategy, and she started talking and you interrupted her? And I got really defensive, and I was like, yes, I did interrupt her. She was rambling, and the CEO is a really busy guy. And I kind of thought that was that, you know, it was obvious. And Steve nodded. He wasn't ruffled. He was very patient. He said, you know, Amy, did you notice that when the CFO asked Brooke about the numbers, and they were right in front of Brooke on the table, you didn't even let Brooke answer it. You just jumped in. Now, in addition to being very competitive, I also, as you heard, am a perfectionist, and I felt this enormous pit in my stomach. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about, but it's the feeling that I have made a terrible mistake, and I started to feel huge waves of shame, embarrassment, and I wanted to be anywhere but there. You're nodding. Do you know what I'm saying?
Absolutely. Surely we've all been through that at some point.
Yeah,
right?
It's like, does anyone else want to join my recovering perfectionist club? I was horrified because then Steve asked me, Amy, did you notice what was happening for Brooke and Jenny the last 10 minutes of the meeting? And I realized in that moment, it was like a light bulb went off. I was laser focused on, you know, who I thought was the most important people in the room, the CEO, CFO. I totally ignored my team. And he said, Brooke looked like he wanted to throw something. He was furious. Jenny looked so uncomfortable. I think, you know, wanted to be anywhere but there. And Amy, I'm afraid you're going to lose your team. I think you should go check in on them. And he was right. I did check in on them. They were furious with me. I mean, here I was. I thought I'd done this amazing thing. We launched the website, you know, but that wasn't what mattered. I had invalidated them. And Steve said in the meeting, he's like, you know, Amy, I know you can be a great manager. I know how much you care. I love how competitive you are. But a great manager lets their people shine. And, you know, so in that conversation, you know, he knows how sensitive I am. He knows that in the moment it was going to really hurt, but he knew what really mattered to me, and what really mattered to me was being a great manager. And certainly it would have been so much easier for him to just say, hey, congrats on getting that new project, or congrats on launching the website. That would have been the easiest thing in the world for him. He wouldn't have had to deal with my emotions. And so we would call that ruinous empathy, where you're so afraid of like hurting the person's feelings that you don't say the hard thing. That's a mistake that I make a lot, where it's like, oh, but they did so well. But meanwhile, 6 months later, I've lost my team because he didn't have the courage to tell me. So I think there's a lot of courage. And when you think about, if I really do care about this person, am I willing to tell them? The other thing I want to mention is that I think it's really important to think about, not just in the moment, how is that person showing that kind of care and challenge, but what are they doing, kind of relationship deposits leading up on it. And I think it's really important to think about the people that we work with. How well do you know them? What does care personally look like for them? So for me, and again, this is going to be different for everyone. For me, there were a couple things. One, a very heavy door fell on me while I was traveling. And he stayed on the phone with me like all night because I had a concussion. But even more important, I was mentioning about Search Inside Yourself, the training program. It was expensive, and my company didn't want to pay for it because, mindfulness was not a thing at the time. But Steve found budget because he knew how important it was for me. Like, regardless of the company, he was investing in me and what was really important to me in my own growth. And so even though it felt like a kick in the gut in the moment, like, that's the other thing, is like, you're still going to have your emotional experience, but I knew he was sharing it to help me grow. And what we find is that when people kind of all come together and share, what does care personally look like? And check this for yourself. And as you're listening to this, it's usually the person took the time to do it. Like, they didn't have to do it. They took the time. They did it to be helpful. Like, he really did this because he's like, I know where you can go. Like, so the challenge was also very, very kind. And then they do this in the conception of your own success. Like, what are the things that you really need to help you grow, to help you succeed?
That's such a great story. Thank you so much for sharing. I just wonder as well, you mentioned that you then went off to check on your team, and I wonder what the other side of it was. Did they feel comfortable to share how furious they were with you at the time, or was that something that you had to build with them?
It's such a great question, and it brings us to kind of our order of operations, which is that, sometimes, and you might have been doing this, you think, oh, we're talking about feedback. First, we think about criticism. And in fact, we're talking more about praise than criticism. But even more important, we actually want to start any relationship we're building by asking for feedback. And especially if we are managers, especially if we are leaders, especially if we have some form of power. By the way, even if we don't think we do, we do. If we're a manager, we do have some power there. We have got to lay down the power. But this goes for any work relationship. Start by asking for feedback. And I realized that I had not been asking them for feedback. I'd not been asking my team for feedback. I didn't know that was a thing. I know now. And so, part of it is that in the moment, how do you build safety with people? And people might say, oh, yeah, it's okay. Or, they might not respond sort of in the moment to it. But we are building relationships. And so you keep checking in. And so for me, what I found in the whole kind of aftermath of those things, as well as the times when I didn't say the thing, or I said it too late, my own ruinous empathy story where I didn't say the thing and I didn't say the thing and I didn't say the thing until this person's job was on the line, and I had to tell them, and they were furious with me, like, why didn't you tell me? And the reason why I'm so motivated to practice radical candor is because relationships that really mattered to me were damaged because, I didn't say the thing in the moment. So I was able to kind of navigate through it in that example. But what I will say is that it is not a one and done. When you have damaged trust, we need to continually check in. These are ongoing relationships. And I think most important when we're asking for feedback, when we're trying to build a relationship, is we need to reward the candor. If somebody gives us some feedback and we ignore it, we don't follow up with it, think about it for yourself. Not just for your boss, but especially if you give a peer feedback and they ignore it, you're not going to go back and give them that, feedback again. You're not going to take the risk. So much of it depends on how we gauge how what we're saying is landing. And it was clear for me I was going to need to spend a lot of time rebuilding their relationship and showing them that it wasn't just a one and done, that it was ongoing. And then I'd continually be checking in. And especially about meetings, if we tend to talk too much in meetings, or we're not, giving, more introverted folks a voice, checking in after the meeting and say, hey, this is really important to me. It's something I'm working on. Can you let me know, like, when could I have given you the floor in this meeting? Or when did I know I tend to talk over people. When could I have done something a little different in that meeting?
Yeah. And I think the other thing with the book as well, when you talk about feedback, I remember Kim had written in there that feedback doesn't always have to be sit down in a meeting and have a formal, it can literally be 2-minute walk down the corridor, stood getting a cup of tea or a cup of coffee or whatever, and just giving those little bits of feedback. And also about the being specific. I was actually just speaking with a colleague this morning and giving some feedback and actually how important it is to be specific about even the positive things, because otherwise it just feels a bit general. It just doesn't have the same impact. When you say to someone, yeah, that was great, then going, actually, it was this part, that part of it was really great because X, Y, Z.
Oh, 100%. Those are such important points. I really appreciate you spelling them out. We talk about radically candid criticism is kind and clear, and praise is specific and sincere. And one of the things we will do in workshops is we'll ask people, like, why is it hard to give and receive criticism? What makes praise more or less effective? And usually it's this idea, if it's vague, if it's not specific, great job, you're an idiot, right? Like, no, none of those are helpful, right? So we want it to be helpful. We're doing this to help the person grow. Like, am I sharing this with this person because this is to help them grow, or am I sharing it with them because I'm really pissed off, right? And I might have, a real emotion there, but really getting into that mindset of I'm doing this to help them grow. But the other thing that you said, we think about this idea of like 2-minute impromptu conversations. I think the word feedback is really hard. We haven't yet found, I think, a better word, but it really is, I am willing to share my candid perspective with you and be open to the fact that this is a two-way street. Like, how do you see it? So for example, if I may give you some public praise, Chloe. So, at the opening, when you asked about radical candor, so that would be the context, you brought in the phrase care personally and challenge directly. That's the observation. So you brought in the phrase care personally and challenge directly. Now, if you think about context, so we're in the podcast, the observation, you shared the phrase care personally and challenge directly. Why does this matter? This is what we would call the result. What is the most important part? Like, why was this helpful? Helpful for you, for our conversation, for your listeners. So for me, I think the most important result would be it showed me that you read the book and that you wanted to communicate to the audience the core principle of radical candor. It's care personally and challenge directly. And what we did was, some people might be familiar with the SBI model of feedback from the Center for Creative Leadership. We added this idea of a next step. And this is really important because usually feedback is kind of like looking back to a thing. And we can look back even in this conversation, like, oh, we were in the conversation and you said care personally and challenge directly. Now let's move into like development or moving forward. We're sort of agreed on this thing that happened. So, you're nodding, so I'm assuming you agreed. Yeah, I did say care personally and challenge directly. Yeah. And so, but sometimes we might not agree, right? Like, we might have a very different interpretation of the thing that happened. So now we're going to move into what would the challenge be? What would the next step be? A next step could be as simple as like, I encourage you to use your knowledge of radical candor to make sure I get to the key points more succinctly, or I encourage you to repeat the key points for the audience to really understand it, something like that. So what's one way, just basically keep it up, keep doing that. That would be a great example for praise. And then let's say that, in criticism, a next step could be, hey, let's meet next Tuesday and talk about how we can better prepare for the following podcast that we're going to do, something like that. But it's specific. And sometimes I think people feel like they have to have it all figured out in this one conversation. Do you know what I'm talking about? Where it's like, there could be multiple things happening here. And so a fine next step is to ask that person, so, hey, Chloe, what's another way that we could do that question, right? I could ask for your perspective on how might we want to get back into that piece of content. Or I might ask you, what do you think a good next step from this conversation might be, right? So we can kind of co-create it. Don't feel like you're always the one that has to, have the clear path. But we do want to leave the conversation that we are both clear on what is happening.
Yeah, absolutely. So that kind of coaching style, I love that as well, because it brings out that authenticity from the person. It gives them the freedom to actually come up with their own ideas. And like you say, both leaving with that understanding that, we both understand what's happening. We both know where we're going with this and we're both happy with it, is really clear. And actually, one of the things that I find kind of fascinating with Radical Candor, you talked just a second ago about kind of giving the feedback, and it feels a lot of the time like it falls into a place that as humans we might feel a little bit uncomfortable with. You mentioned earlier, even the word feedback is just, sometimes I get really uncomfortable with praise.
Yeah.
I prefer the constructive stuff, but some people, really suffer.
And I just put you on the spot by giving you public praise. So thank you for modeling that. Yeah.
But, some people feel the opposite, and actually the constructive stuff really hurts or gets under their skin. And, the thing that really gets to me is how someone might go against the basic human instinct and say something that might feel almost like they're starting a conflict, giving this criticism to somebody, even though they care personally. How does someone overcome that uncomfortable feeling inside?
Yeah, it's such a great point. I mean, we are going against, how we've been wired. When you think about what makes care personally hard, you think about what makes challenge directly hard. Care personally, one of these messages, and Kim talks about it in the book, is that, many of us, and it can depend on, where you're from and, family of origin and generationally, but many of us got a message, be professional, sort of like leave the best part of us at home and show up at work as sort of this buttoned up professional. And I think that's changing a bit, but there's still this idea that we can't necessarily fully show our humanity. But what we really are talking about here is building authentic relationships at work, that it's not about just a transaction. It really is that there is another human being. It's about creating this sense of common human decency, of respect for the people that we work with, where our fates are really tied up with each other, that we actually get more done together when we see the humanity in each other. So that one's hard because we kind of got this message, just when we're starting to go out in the work world, be professional. So it's like, oh, okay, I guess I will leave that part of me at home. And then there's this other message from an even younger age, and I've traveled all over the world, and so many of us got some message of, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. I'm curious, Chloe, did you get some message like that? Isn't
it Bambi that does that? Isn't it?
Yeah.
Is it Bumper that says? I still say it now. I still say if you but only when I think it's important to note that that's only when it's not constructive and it's just not very nice. That's when I use that
and
phrase.
I think there's this difference between nice and kind. And so
absolutely.
if I'm a big fan of Brene Brown, and it's this idea of, kind is clear, clear is kind. And I think, if you are working in the workplace, there is this message of what, it's now actually our job to say the not very nice thing. And we would argue, especially if you're a manager, it's your obligation, because people are not going to know what's working or what's not working. So if you're thinking about praise as hey, you're doing this thing, keep doing it. This is working really well. Let me tell you specifically what you're doing and why it's working. So if people are familiar with that sort of start, stop, continue model, so continue would be praise, and criticism would be either start doing something that you haven't been doing or stop doing this thing that you have been doing, can also be helpful. But we are not going to know unless people tell us. Now, there's a few, I think, really important guidelines to what you're talking about of emotions, that there might be emotions. And so much of this is, how are we providing our feedback, both our praise and criticism? First of all, in terms of building that relationship, have I been practicing the order of operations? Have I started by asking for feedback? In many ways, this gives us a little bit more ability to to move on and be giving people criticism and praise, where it builds us a little bit more buy-in and trust from that other person. We're sort of showing that we can take it before we start dishing it out, especially for managers laying the power down. We want to be giving more praise than criticism. This is really important. I think many people kind of short shrift praise. Oh, good job. That was great. No, praise, specific and sincere praise, shows people what we value, why it's important, the things that we want them to replicate. It's very different to say to someone, great job on the website. I can't control that outcome, but what were the specific steps that I took so that we got there? That is what can be replicated. And praise, we want to do both privately to build the relationship, but we can also do publicly. Now, some people, like you said, are uncomfortable with public praise. It's helpful to know. But the point of public praise is really to show people what we value, to show kind of what good looks like. Criticism, we want to do privately. To your point, when we do this publicly, we damage a relationship. So to go back to the story that I shared about Steve, if in the middle of that meeting, Steve, yelled at me and said, Amy, you're ignoring your team. They hate you. I would have known what the problem was, right? Like the challenge would have been very clear, but he would have blown up our relationship. I would have been humiliated in front of the CEO, the CFO, my team. It would have really destroyed trust. So we want to criticize privately. Now, criticism is very different from debate. Like a healthy debate, should we go plan A versus plan B? We're sort of talking about different ideas, having a debate of ideas versus, criticizing someone about their behavior or their work product and doing it in that very specific way that I outlined through CORE: context, observation, result, and next steps. So I think it's important to think about like the how we're doing it. And there still might be emotion. I mean, I think this is the most important part of all of it, is that somehow that idea of like be professional and like we can show up at work and not have emotions. Like we are going to have emotions. It's actually how we show up with the other person when there are some emotions. That is how we can build an even more trusting relationship. We can talk about that, but I think just naming that just because somebody has an emotional reaction does not mean the conversation didn't go well. It's really how are we showing up with them in that moment.
Yeah. And I think there's something that I kind of struggled a little bit to understand the concept of. One of the things I took away from the book was, I think Kim mentioned measuring the impact from the listener's ear rather than from your own mouth. I think I paraphrased that a bit, but absolutely how it's heard rather than how it's said. And that's something that I honestly kind of struggle to understand in some ways, because as a manager, like you said, sometimes you have to give criticism. You have to share that in order to help somebody. And I think of like our spheres of control, and I can control how I say something and the intention behind it and the way it's said. I can't control how it lands. So how would someone be able to kind of navigate that when what they're saying comes from a really good place and they know it comes from that really good place, but it hasn't landed well?
This is such a beautiful question. I mean, this is really at the heart of the practice. This is why Radical Candor requires a lot of other skills. It requires self-awareness. It requires emotional management. It requires relational awareness. It's one-on-one conversations. It's one-on-one real-time conversations where if we're not doing it in person, we're doing it through video, or we know each other well enough on a phone call that we've agreed on that we can, pick up all of those sort of the nonverbals, the body language, etc. Knowing how can we know how what we're saying is landing. This is why we are not sending criticism through Slack. We are not breaking up with people by text, right? If we are someone, for me, like I'm someone who I can clarify my thinking by writing it. So I would write, context, observation, result, next steps. Very helpful to go into a conversation and have that written down so that I know what I want to say. But all of a sudden, here I am right now, Chloe, I'm in a conversation with you, and what I'm saying isn't landing well. And so part of it is I want to get really curious. Why is what I'm saying not landing well? And what we'll actually do in a workshop is we'll have people practice with like real feedback situations so that they can kind of role play how that might land. So even understanding, okay, public praise isn't comfortable for you. So, what's a better way that I could have done it? Now, I think, we will say in the model that there's a value of public praise because it helps people sort of know what good looks like. But sometimes public praise can really go awry. If it's like, oh, Chloe, or Amy, great job on the website. And meanwhile, like I've got my team who actually worked on the website, and now my team thinks I'm just claiming all the glory, or, so there can be these reasons why things fall flat when it comes to this idea of impact and intention. So what is my intention when I'm going into the conversation? Can be very helpful practice for us to have. So my intention is to, and Chloe, I'm just curious, do you have an example of like a piece of feedback on your mind that you would like to give someone, or from a previous job, just something that would be helpful to kind of work through, like a kind of example on your mind?
Like a constructive or like a criticism?
Yeah, like
or
a
positive
piece of criticism. Like, let's say, someone's been late multiple times to a recording, or somebody's been giving you notes and there's been multiple errors, and now you're having to stay up late to fix the errors, or, there's certain classic things like that. Is there anything on your mind?
In my last role, I headed up 3 customer service teams, and I had supervisors that reported into me, and I was working really hard with the supervisors to try and kind of build their skill set. And one of them really, really struggled to delegate and would rather just keep everything and just get it done themselves. So one of my kind of constant feedbacks for them was, you need to delegate more. And I was constantly trying to pick up on areas where things could have been delegated.
Yeah, it's such a great example. And, when we keep running into the same issue, it may be, what I have found is that sometimes it's not clear for that person sort of what good looks like. They might not know. They might not have an example. Sometimes people might not have the resources. Like they might not have the ability. I mean, delegating is such an interesting one. We've actually had some podcast episodes on the Radical Candor podcast about, this idea of micromanaging. I have a tendency to micromanage. We tend to, our goal is to be a thought partner where we're sort of, partnering with the folks on our team. Sometimes we might be, an absentee manager. Jason, my boss, our CEO, he likes to work on his own. And so a really good question for someone who has that tendency is to say, hey, where did you need me last week and I wasn't available? Or when might you need me next week that it would help you to, for us to work together, something like that. For me, as someone with micromanaging tendencies, a very helpful question to ask would be like, where did you not need me last week, et cetera? And so just knowing that different people are going to need different things. And I think getting curious, like sometimes when you look at like the need underneath the behavior of like, I'm nervous that they're not going to do it right, or I'm afraid, or these fears. And so when I have something like that, I would probably just start asking a bunch of questions like, hey, I've checked in with, we've had this conversation about delegation. I'm still observing this behavior. Help me understand what's going on for you about that, and trying to understand what their kind of roadblocks are. And they might not even be aware, or they might not understand what delegation means. And very often, like things in our brain, especially when we've done it a lot, are very obvious. And so even breaking them down into smaller and smaller parts, and even just having a conversation like, hey, on this project, maybe one of your concerns is, I think if I do it this way, we're going to get to a much better outcome versus if I give this piece of the work to X, Y, and Z. So it's like, I hear you. I want to make sure that your whole team is optimized. So just as an experiment, just try one thing, like for next week, try giving this one piece to Sally, and let's check in and let's see how it goes. And just as an experiment, and seeing like just sort of that experimental mindset, starting really, really small, because I think often when we get into this perennial behavior, there's usually something underneath it that's getting in the way, and maybe we just haven't bubbled up like where the actual source of disagreement is coming from.
Yeah, and do you know what's interesting, Amy, is that since my last role, I'm now a leadership coach myself, and I coach a lot of new leaders specifically in that kind of transition into a leadership role. And I think with my experience now, I look back and realize that a lot of the time, new leaders really struggle with delegating just because they feel bad about it. They feel bad about asking someone else to pick up the task. And a lot of the time I try and reframe delegation into empowerment, because actually delegating is such an empowering thing when it's done correctly. So it's interesting how much you learn when you step back from the situation as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. I love that awareness. And yeah, we learn so much. And I'm sure you are so successful as a leadership coach from having that experience and the empowerment. I love that you brought in the idea of empowerment and our sort of the what's underneath it, and bringing in new managers, new leaders. Oh my gosh, like they're more identifying this mindset shift of like, I'm still judging myself as an individual contributor, and being a great individual contributor means like doing all the things. And it's like, hey, no, now being a great manager and leader means like you need to leverage your team and learn to trust your team. Part of it's like, oh, but I don't want to be seen like the big bad boss. And, so bubbling up some of those concerns, which I'm sure is what you're doing in your leadership coaching.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how would you coach yourself now?
Oh my gosh, that's a question, isn't it? How would I coach myself now? Oh, do you know, there was so much to unpack, because I literally went from being kind of just answering the phone without even a job title to being a senior manager. So going through all the imposter syndrome stuff and just figuring out how to lead as I went. And I think I made every single mistake along the way. So as I look back at different parts of my journey, I think, wow, there was micromanagement. There you gave too much freedom. There you didn't criticize, and you could have done with some radical candor. So it's hard to answer that in one short burst, I think, looking back.
I think it's exactly right. It's like we have all these moments. And I think, again, just going back to where we were at the top of like reframing those mistakes and those failures, like that is how we learn. I mean, why Kim did not write this book, 20 whatever years ago, and instead had to make all these mistakes. But, I find we learn so much more from mistakes. I will share, as painful as they might be, about a week ago, I'm a very careful driver, and I tried to get into one of these parking spots, and it said compact. And my car is relatively compact, but anyhow, you can imagine I had a run-in with this pole, and there's now a large dent on the side of my door. And I took it to this guy, and it was going to be very, very expensive. And I was like, gosh, if I could just go back and rewind that. And he's like, well, you're never going to make that mistake again. And I was like, you know what? You are correct. Like every time now but we don't often learn these things until we've done it and we see the pain. And the reason why I teach Radical Candor, why I am so passionate about it, is to go back to your other point of like, these are unnatural behaviors, right? We are wired as a tribe to not be kicked out of the tribe, to belong, so saying the hard thing can be quite hard. But I know what happens when I don't say it, that the damage of the relationships that were really important to me. And so that is what motivates me to sort of out-create my ruinous empathy. And I'll share a quick story on, what you were saying of like, what's hard about this, like the human tendency. We had a partnership with Second City Works, their improvisation group. And before you go on stage, every time you say, got your back. And in fact, we say that on the podcast too, because the idea is if you're going on stage real time, you want to feel like people are supporting you and we've got each other's backs. So anyhow, we're about to go on stage. I'm going to talk about Radical Candor. We've got a couple improvisers to kind of show the mistakes that we make when we're not practicing Radical Candor. And one of the improvisers comes out of the bathroom, the restroom. I know it's different translations in the UK. And his fly was down. And my first response was, who's going to tell this guy his fly is down? Right? Like, it was just like, it's not like we sort of noticed the problem, and it's someone else, like someone else is going to figure that out. And I said, Amy, this is internal. I said to myself, Amy, first of all, you're teaching Radical Candor. Second of all, there is truly no one between this guy and the audience. And so I pulled him to the side. I told him he was an improviser. So of course it was very funny. But I share that story because like I teach this, just like I teach mindfulness. I teach this to hold myself accountable to something that I know really matters. And I think looking at the mistakes that we make is so helpful. Looking at the kind of why this is hard is so helpful to kind of normalize, like, oh, it doesn't mean that now, like, I don't feel nervous before having these conversations. Like, I do, but I know the value. And I know that the only way to build even better relationships is by having these conversations. No one has built a better relationship with someone by ignoring all of the things, right? Like, we really need to invest in it. And so if I am going to go on stage, and you think about the equivalent in a company culture, if we are going to feel safe at work, that there's not all of these side conversations happening, or I'm not been like messing up left and right and nobody is telling me, like, that is how we build that safety and that trust. And so just to go back to like those quadrants and the mistakes that we make. So one mistake, that obnoxious aggression, where we're, kind of talking publicly to the person, we're yelling at them. So the mistake, the challenge directly is clear, but there's no care personally. The mistake I haven't yet mentioned in the bottom left of that 2x2 framework we've been talking about, Kim called it manipulative insincerity. This is low care, low challenge. And this is one that, it can be fun to tell stories when we've acted like a jerk. It can be fun to tell stories that was like, oh, I just care too much. This one is a little harder to look at ourselves in the mirror, because this one is where we're not caring, we're not challenging. This is often the meeting after the meeting, or this is the sort of the office gossip. This is the maybe complaining about something to someone else and hoping they'll get irritated enough they'll say something. This is, by the way, also, even the worst case, like very like political, toxic, backstabbing. But I think in a day-to-day, this is more just those side conversations, and we're not going directly to people. And this is really where I think the most toxic behavior can happen. And this goes back to your question about intent and impact. This one's really important. So you think about the example I was sharing, and think about for yourself, Chloe. I'm sure you had some examples where, like you were talking about, you don't say something to someone because you don't want to hurt their feelings, right? So that would be ruinous empathy. I'm caring, I'm thinking about them. But very often, we're also thinking about ourselves. And that would be the manipulative insincerity, where I didn't want to deal with his discomfort. I didn't want to deal with, I don't like conflict. I don't want a difficult conversation. I want everyone to like me. Maybe for those new managers, like, oh my gosh, like now I have to be the bad guy. I don't want to be that, right? And so that's really that bottom left quadrant where we're not caring, we're not challenging. And so for me, I think thinking about these mistakes, not as personality, not like putting people in boxes, not as like a personality test, but really as behaviors, so that we can kind of move more in the direction. Like, can I be more caring? Can I be more challenging? Noticing like, oh gosh, I am really hanging out in this quadrant. And the reason why this intent versus impact question you had is so important is I will often ask people, what mistake do you tend to make the most at work? So I'm curious, like Chloe, for yourself, which mistake? Ruinous empathy, obnoxious aggression, manipulative insincerity. Do you feel like you have a mistake that you tend to make more often than not?
Oh, that's a really tough one. I think at different times, I think sometimes I think I'm being radically candid, and it can be a bit more like obnoxious aggression. I think I've fallen into obnoxious aggression probably more times in my career. Maybe not so much now, because we practice all of this. We practice great feedback and radical candor. So I work really hard to be, super radically candid rather than obnoxiously aggressive. But I can definitely relate to those stories where the obnoxious aggression comes out, which makes me feel awful when you have to put yourself into a quadrant.
Well, and that's why we don't want this to be like, this is about behaviors and not about personality types, right? So I think that's really important for your audience to understand. Like one of the other things, and we didn't have time to really go into the stories, but like I will share stories when I was acting obnoxiously aggressive, when I was acting in a way that was manipulatively insincere, when I was acting in ruinous empathy. And by the way, you can act in each of these quadrants just in one conversation. So it's critical to your point, like these are not personality types, these are behaviors. That's why the framework is so helpful. For me, though, I would say the mistake I probably tend to make the most is ruinous empathy. But when I'm really stressed, I know I land in obnoxious aggression. Like I'm going right to the challenge. So to your point, different times we might land in different places.
I think the thing with obnoxious aggression as well is that sometimes I don't feel that I'm saying anything that's aggressive. So it can, from my perspective, it's just a fact. Whereas when it lands, I don't think about kind of how it might make someone feel. And I think that's why it falls into that obnoxious aggression, doesn't it? Because I kind of take the emotion out of, whatever it is we might be working on and say, well, that didn't work because of X, Y, Z. Actually, I forget that people have put in a lot of effort maybe behind the scenes of that, and that might unpick a lot of hours of work. So, that still falls into obnoxious aggression, doesn't it?
Well, again, it goes back to, measured, not at my mouth as the speaker, but at the other person's ear. And so it could be a really great exercise, even with the people that we work closely with, of like, what would be the most helpful way for you to receive feedback from me? Like, what does radical candor look like for you? So let's say, we had a project and it didn't work as well. And one of, again, it goes back to like giving examples, people sharing examples of like, oh, this is what care personally looks like for me. This is what challenge directly looks like for me. Because again, it's going to look different. So there might be some people where, what you say of, hey, just tell me like what didn't work well, I'll go work on it. And for other people, look, we've spent 3 months on this project. This part's working really great. This part is falling short. Let's figure out how we can bump this one up, or, whatever it might be. But that also goes to why we want to be having frequent feedback, right? So that they don't have to be this like big, oh my God, I'm just hearing about it at the end of the project, but rather, we're praising more often than we're giving criticism, so that we're kind of, again, going back to those 1, 2, 5 minute sort of impromptu chats, we're just meeting things where they are, say, oh, this one didn't work as well. Like, what's another way we could try this out? Or, I'd recommend you try this one versus that one, and see how that works. The other thing about impact versus intention, so like you said, just like my intent, I thought I was being radically candid. It landed as obnoxious aggression for that person. So really checking in with that person, like, hey, I am really trying to be kind and clear here. How is it landing for you? The thing that I think is very interesting about the other sides of, I'm sort of pointing out a 2x2, if we're sort of moving to the left side of care personally, which is ruinous empathy and manipulative insincerity. We call these false harmony, because we're sort of optimizing for harmony, but at a cost. And for me, like, harmony is my number one priority. So I have really had to build the muscle of challenge directly. The care personally comes a little more naturally for me. For you, maybe the challenge directly comes a little more naturally, and we need to move up on care personally. So each person is going to come at this with different strengths. What I think is really interesting, to go back to the question I asked you, is I will ask, and I'll do this anonymously for safety. I'll ask people, which mistake do they tend to make the most? And most of the time, people will answer ruinous empathy, or it depends on the culture, but we'll see sort of more ruinous empathy than the other quadrants as the sort of self-identified. Usually some obnoxious aggression and some manipulative insincerity. Often, when we ask people, what mistake do you experience most at work? I'm curious, what do you think, Chloe? Do you have a guess what happens from that ruinous empathy?
Well, I mean, I can only speak from my own experience, but I think I've probably experienced more obnoxious aggression, and that's possibly where I've kind of developed it.
Yeah. And again, it's such a great example because, I think people are coming into the idea of feedback so much from our own lived experience. And so since we're sharing from our perspectives, of course, we're going to bring that in, and especially around, life experience and areas around diversity and inclusion. What often happens, people will say, let's say a majority identified that, okay, the mistake I make the most is ruinous empathy. Often we will find that the majority will say, I'm experiencing more manipulative insincerity at work. And it goes exactly, Chloe, to what you were saying about impact and intention, which is that when I am the one like not giving the feedback in the case of ruinous empathy, I know my intention. My intention is I don't want to hurt this person's feelings. But all this other person knows or senses is that there's this thing happening outside and nobody's telling me. And meanwhile, there's probably this side conversation happening about, oh my gosh, I can't believe Amy just said that thing on the podcast. And the Slack is going. And so I feel so unsafe because there's just this sense that there's all of this other stuff because I am not getting any feedback. It's called the fundamental attribution error, right? Like we know what our intentions are, but we tend to ascribe like bad intentions to the other people because we don't know, right? And so for me, when I see that, it helps people realize like, oh, and for me to get really honest with myself of like, oh yeah, and there's that part of me that I'm more worried about myself. That's why I'm not saying this because I'm burnt out, I'm stressed. Like they just need to figure it out. They're just going to, all of these things that we tell ourselves. And so another reason why I practice and I teach this is so that I don't land in that quadrant as, more often than I need to, because like I want to live in a different way. But I think just saying that it's normal, it's natural, it's human that we kind of land sometimes there to protect ourselves and to connect with other people that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Amy, I feel like I could talk about these different quadrants with you all day long. But if our listeners are intrigued by Radical Candor and you had to give them 1 or 2 tips to get started, what would that be?
Well, tip number 1, listen to our podcast. So wherever podcasts are listened to for you, it's also on radicalcandor.com/podcast. So check out our podcast, of course, the book. And I would encourage two tips. One tip is to start by asking for feedback. What's one thing that I could do that would make it easier for us to work together? Or what's one thing I could have done in the last week that would have helped you feel more effective in this job? Or, hey, here's what I was trying to do when I shared that story on the podcast, Chloe. What's one way I could have shared it even more effectively, right? So ask someone a question for feedback and share what Radical Candor looks like for you. Share a story, share, your vision of like, gosh, I really appreciate getting feedback from Jason. He takes the time. He asks me a lot of questions. Those are some of the ways that he shows me he cares. So what does Radical Candor look like for you? Share with the people you work with and start by asking for feedback.
Amazing. And there's a new book, isn't there? There's one that came out in May. Is it Radical Respect?
It's Radical Respect. Kim Scott has a new book. And in many ways, it's kind of a prequel to Radical Candor, because if we cannot respect the people that we work with as real human beings, we are not going to care personally about them. We are not going to challenge them directly. And so how can we, create more respectful workplaces, understanding tips, very practical tips about how to deal with bias, with prejudice, and with bullying in the workplace? How can we create more respectful workplaces?
Amazing. Well, I look forward to reading that one. I can highly recommend the Radical Candor book and the podcast. So yeah, I think that will definitely be in the show notes for our listeners. And so final question for you then, since we are the Beautiful Business podcast, what does beautiful business mean to you?
Well, first of all, I love that you ask that question. And as I reflect on it, beautiful business is when people at work feel free to express and experience their beautiful, and I would spell it beautiful, like 2 words, their beautiful humanity, so that they can really do more together than they ever could on their own. So when we feel free to express our beautiful selves.
I love that. Thank you so much for joining me today, Amy. It's been such a wonderful conversation with you. And like I say, let me know the next time you walk on fire. I'd quite like to see it on video or something, right?
I'll share some photos afterwards for sure.
Excellent. Thank you, Amy.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Beautiful Business podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, then please remember to subscribe and leave us a review. For more advice and practical tips on what it's really like to build a beautiful business, visit our content hub at wowco.uk/hub or check out the link in the show notes.